What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be discussing the Magicka Templar. Specifically, we're going to be going over a ranged build for the Magicka Templar, just because with the way puncturing sweeps is currently bugged in terms of damage calculation as well as radiant oppression, ranged Magplars are actually pulling higher DPS than your traditional melee Magplar. So a lot of people who are maining Magplars as their DPS are switching over to a ranged build using Force Pulse or Crushing Shock compared to puncturing sweeps. Now there is a fix in the works for the Q1 DLC update that will fix the bug with the damage calculation, so hopefully melee Magplars will see a comeback and we'll see their DPS improve so it's competitive with Magicka Sorks and Magicka Nightblades. But for right now, Magicka Templars are kind of close to the bottom of the DPS totem pole, so to speak, only really being beaten out by Magicka Wardens in terms of lower DPS. However, Magicka Templars still provide very good utility because of they can make great use of the Asylum staff, which helps improve off-balance uptime and concussed uptime, as well as their faster res speed. So for progression groups, if you have a Magplar that can pull very good DPS, like 30k plus, it is a welcome addition to have, just so you have less downtime when people do end up going down during a fight. So we're going to start off here with gear. So this is on the live server, so this is why I don't have a lot of purple gear. I have a lot of purple gear because it does cost a lot of money in order to gold out all of the equipment I have across all of my DPS. So for our monster helm, we're going to be going with Ilambris. I do have a health enchant on my large piece, and that's just because I am using Witchmother's Potent Brew, so I do need that health enchant in order to get up to an appropriate level of health. Without it, I'm sitting at about 15.3k health, so I do need to have that health enchant there. So I personally am comfortable sitting at 16.3, 16.4k health because I know the mechanics of most of the trials and I'm comfortable enough with it. So I'll only really increase my health for the more difficult trials, like halls and maw and things like that. If you want to hit that 17k recommended health for vet trials, you're going to need to either go with Skoria as your monster helm instead of Ilambris, or put a couple points into your health attributes instead of Magicka. So that's kind of up to you. You can also just use blue food instead of max health, max Magicka, in order to get up to an appropriate level of health. But in return, you end up losing out on Magicka regen, and Templars are second only to Magicka Sorcerers when it comes to poor sustain. Because Mag Decays, as long as there's off balance, have very good sustain, and Magicka Nightblades have Siphoning Strikes, which really helps out their sustain as well. For our 5-piece set, we're going with Julianos. This is a crafted set, very easy to obtain, only 6 traits needed, and it's a very powerful set. Now you can use War Maiden if you'd like, which boosts magic damage, but it's not really gonna outperform Julianos. If we take a look at War Maiden, I do have a piece of War Maiden here. Here we go. So purple quality here, but if we move it up to gold, you see it adds 400 spell damage to our magic damage ability. So magic damage, not spell damage, so this only boosts magic damage. So things like Purifying Light and Radiant Destruction, for instance, are affected by War Maiden. So in order for War Maiden to beat out Julianos, 75% of your damage needs to come from magic damage, and that's not going to be the case. From your light attacks and your blockades alone, you're already looking at about 25% DPS. So obviously you're not going to be able to get 75% of your DPS coming from magic damage abilities. So while War Maidens is a potentially good choice, Julianos will beat it out in every single scenario and pretty much every single build as well. For our jewelry, we're going to be running 3-piece Willpower because we are using an Asylum staff. We have 3 spell damage enchants, but you can swap out one of them with a regen enchant for some additional sustain if you'd like. I like to just stick with 3 spell damage enchants. The alternative is to go with the Minor Slayer set, so that's either Moondancer, Infallible Aether, or Master Architect, whichever one you happen to get first. So if you do that, again, you want to stick with either 3 spell damage or 2 spell damage and 1 regen glyph, and instead of the Asylum staff, you'll be using that Minor Slayer set staff. However, you can still use the Asylum staff instead. I still recommend using the Asylum staff instead for that concentrated force set uptime. The difference between 3-piece Willpower and 3-piece Minor Slayer is pretty small, all things considered. So our front bar here is Asylum Inferno Staff, or you can have an perfected Asylum's Inferno Staff. It's going to be obviously be better. Infused with a shock damage enchant, and that's just because of the concentrated force set effect. For every third cast with the imperfect, every other cast with a perfect staff, you apply burning, concussed, and chilled with your force pulse or crushing shock. So that really helps contribute to concussed uptime. So for your weapon damage enchant, if you have an imperfect Inferno Staff, go with a shock damage enchant, because that'll help maintain your concussed uptime. Every third cast is a bit longer compared to the perfect Inferno, which is every other cast. If you do have a perfect Inferno, you can swap to a fire damage enchant, because every other cast is actually fairly often, so you'll be able to maintain much higher concussed uptime with the perfected Inferno versus a non-perfect Inferno Staff. And for our back bar, we have a Nirn Maelstrom Lightning Staff with a weapon damage enchant. Now you can use Sharpened or Precise as a Templar. It's kind of up to you. If you are going to be using Sharpened though, just be aware of where your penetration sits after you include Sharpened, because if you do go over the penetration cap of 18,200 by too much, it ends up being a DPS loss instead of a gain, because you won't have any more resistances to penetrate through. So if you're over penetrating by about 600 or so, or more than that, you're going to want to swap over to Nirn or Precise for your weapon trait, and that's true for your front bar as well. For our attribute points and Mundus stones and things like that, we have 64 points to Magicka, but like I said earlier, if you want to hit 17k health with Witchmothers, you're going to want to move 4 points from Magicka into health. That'll get you up to about 17k health. I am a vampire. For that 10% additional Magicka regen, it's going to be very helpful for you. You don't need to be stage 4, you can be stage 2, so you can feed and become stage 2. I'm just too lazy to do that, so I stick at stage 4. Just keep in mind, if you're going to do that and stay at stage 4, you do take 25% additional fire damage, so that's something to keep in mind. For our Mundus stone, we're going to go with the Apprentice. However, you can use the lever for things like 4-man content and solo content like VMA. Just remember, just like with Sharpened, if you're going over the penetration cap by more than 600 or 700, you're going to have a DPS loss. So for organized trials groups, Apprentice is going to outbeat the lever in most scenarios. I am a Dark Elf. Dark Elf is traditionally been the best go-to race for Templars, because they used to use fire blockade. Now with the shift to the off-balance meta, you're going to see a lot more lightning blockades on your Templar instead. So Altmer has become a close second. The two are pretty much neck and neck when it comes to DPS. So you kind of pick your own poison. I'm sticking with Dunmer because of the off-balance changes that are coming in the Q1 updates with the DLC. So Blockade of Fire might be making a comeback for Templars, so I am sticking with Dark Elf for right now, but do keep in mind that Altmer are a viable alternative because they do get more shock damage out of their visual passives, plus they get 9% additional regen compared to Dark Elves. Another option for race is going to be Bretons, because they do get 10% additional Magicka. They get a nice spell resistance boost as well from their racial passives, plus they get 3% reduction in their Magicka cost in their abilities, so that's a little bit of a nice sustained boost there. It's not quite as good as 9% Magicka regen from Altmers, but it is nice nonetheless. And a kind of a dark horse option for race is going to be Argonians. Argonians have extra health and extra Magicka, but where they really shine is the potion passive that they have. Basically, whenever you drink a potion, it's the same as drinking a tri-stat potion, so you recover Magicka, health, and stamina. So when you use your spell power potions, you end up gaining all 3 resources. So it's a very powerful potion, and it really helps out with sustain in that way. But you do lose out on some Magicka boosts, so that is something to keep in mind. You will end up dropping in DPS, but you gain a pretty significant sustain if you decide to go with an Argonian. It's kind of a dark horse race there. So in terms of skills, our front bar, we have Crushing Shock. You can use Force Pulse instead for the additional DPS, but you are going to lose out on the utility from that interrupt. Vampire's Bane, you can use the other morph, which is Reflective Light. Vampire's Bane will give you higher single target DPS. On the other hand, Reflective Light will give you higher cleave damage because it splits into 3 different projectiles, but you'll sacrifice a little bit of single target DPS if you use Reflective Light instead. You have Purifying Light next. You have Harness Magicka, which is your shield, Inner Light, and then you have Empowering Sweep. Now you're not going to be using Empowering Sweep as your primary damage ultimate. Empowering Sweep is here for the Piercing Spear passive under Aegis Spear, which increases your critical damage done by 10%, but you need to have an Aegis Spear ability slotted. Now traditionally under Melee Magplar you have Puncturing Sweeps on your front bar, so that covers your Aegis Spear ability. However, with a ranged Magplar you don't have any piercing Aegis Spear ability here, so you're going to have to go with Empowering Sweeps for your ultimate in order to maintain that passive boost. And on our back bar we have Blazing Spear, Blockade of Storms, Channeled Focus, Radiant Oppression, Inner Light, and our Destro Staff ulti here. So this is going to be your primary damage ultimate here, Thunderous Rage. Now, talking about positioning when it comes to Radiant Oppression, you will get more single target DPS if you use Radiant Oppression on your front bar and use Harness Magicka on your back bar instead. But that's kind of up to you how you want to play it. If you keep Radiant Oppression on your back bar, during your execute phase, you'll be able to basically stay on this bar more or less with Blockade and Blazing Spear. I'll talk about that when we talk about our rotation. So that's kind of up to you how you want to play it out. So I like to have it on my back bar, but you can put it on your front bar if you want a little bit of extra DPS coming out of it. Now for our champion points. 75 into Arcana, 75 into Tenacity, and that leaves 80 points, which you can put into these next couple of passives however you'd like. I have 26 into Warlord, 26 into Tumbling, and 28 into Shadow Ward. Again, you can split those however you'd like, depending on how often you block and use Break Free. For our mage CPs, 34 into Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert. I have 38 into Spell Erosion, I'll come back to that in a second, 34 into Master at Arms, and 75 into Thaumaturge. Now, Spell Erosion, just like with Sharpened Weapon Traits and Lover Mundus Stone, if you're going over the penetration cap with all your debuffs up, it's going to end up being a DPS loss. So this particular distribution that I have is set up for my primary raid guild, where we only get Elemental Drain, Infused Torx Crusher, and Power of the Light, so we're missing out on the Alkosh debuff. So that's why I have 38 points into Spell Erosion. So if you're in that situation, you want to take points out of Elfborn first, and then Master at Arms, and then put them in a Spell Erosion there. You don't want to touch Elemental Expert or Thaumaturge if you can help it. So if you do have that Alkosh in your group, you're obviously not going to want to put 38 points into Spell Erosion, so you're going to take those points out, put them back into Master at Arms and Elfborn, put them into Master at Arms first, and then Elfborn as a result. And finally, for our red CPs, this is a one-size-fits-most distribution. Depending on what content you're running, you're going to want to change things up accordingly. For example, in Asylum, you might want to put more points into Elemental Expert to help protect yourself from the Exhaustive Breath and other elemental damage that you might be facing. Same thing with Maw and HRC, you're going to want to put more points into Hardy as opposed to Elemental Defender because you're taking more physical damage. 44 into Ironclad, 37 into Thick Skin, 56 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and 37 into Bastion for that extra damage shield. So now we're going to be going over our rotation. So starting things off, you're obviously going to want to buff yourself first before you enter any sort of boss fight. So the only buff that we really have on a Templar is going to be Channeled Focus. You're going to start off by drinking your potion, obviously, and then you're going to start with your back bar. So you're going to go you can do one of two things. You can either go Blockade, and then you can either do Blockade and then animation cancel out of your spear, or you can do the other way around. You can do Spear and then animation cancel out of your Blockade by bar swapping. Now you can go either or, it doesn't really matter, they both have the same exact duration, so you're going to be potentially losing out on one of them anyways. I like Blockade and then Spear. So for those of you guys who are wondering, yes, you can continue to bar swap cancel out of your Blockade because it is considered instant cast, so as soon as the Blockade hits, the damage first, you get that first tick, so you will maintain that VMA set bonus onto your front bar this way. And then after that, you basically go into Vampire's Bane, Reflective Light, and then you start spamming or weaving your spammable, your Crushing Shock, or Force Pulse. Now in terms of which dots you want to maintain, you're going to want to maintain Blockade of Storms for sure, and you're going to want to maintain Blazing Spear if you can, and then Purifying Light comes as a third kind of quasi-dot that you want to maintain. If you have to break your rotation for any reason, like you have to res or you have to play a mechanic or something like that. So for the reason why Blazing Spear is so important is because of Burning Light. I have a 25% chance to deal about 4.8k magic damage every half second. So that's a pretty powerful passive to have, so that's kind of why you want to maintain Blazing Spear as much as you can. So we're going to show you guys how it looks on the 3 million dummy here. So obviously going to start with the buff. You're going to drink your potion, Blockade or Spear, and then the other one, animation cancel out. Light Weave, your effective light. Now if you are using Vampire's Bane, the duration doesn't line up very well. And then I like to heavy attack whenever I have to relay my rune. But that's kind of up to you. You can heavy attack every rotation or every other rotation. If you heavy attack whenever you recast rune, it's going to end up being every other rotation. And so now for execute phase. For execute, you're obviously going to be using Radiant Oppression, and different people have different ways of doing it. Me personally, I like to start execute around 20%. Another Magplar that I run with starts execute at 25%. So the 3 dots that you're going to want to maintain during the execute phase is going to be Blockade, Spear, and the Purifying Light. So typically during execute, I'm going to go Blockade, Spear, Purifying Light, and then back to Radiant Oppression. So on a dummy, it's going to look like this. Radiant Oppression does have a 3-second channel time, so if you do that, you're going to end up dropping one of your dots. As you can see here, you end up having about 2 seconds downtime on your Blockade with that. Now the other option, it's an option that I tend to use more often, just because I don't like the bar swap so often during execute, is you drop Purifying Light and instead you just use Blockade, Spear, and do Radiant Oppression twice. This gives you less downtime on your Blockade, but on the other hand you are losing out on your Purifying Light, which does deal a pretty good part of your DPS, so that's kind of the downside of using that. It's a simpler rotation, but on the other hand you are missing out on the Purifying Light damage, which is a pretty hefty damage there. So some people do it differently, again, just when you start execute and what skills you use during execute. Me personally, when I hit 10%, I actually drop Blazing Spear and just use Blockade and Radiant Oppression instead. So that's kind of up to you. The other Magplar that I've run with on Mayflower, I believe he still maintains Blockade, Spear, and Purifying Light even past 10%. So he doesn't actually spam Radiant Oppression at all. That obviously is going to change if they fix Radiant Oppression with the Q1 DLC, but for right now that's kind of where things are at. So you kind of have options when it comes to your execute phase. So with all that said and done, we're going to go ahead and do a 6 million dummy parse so you guys can kind of see the DPS potential of a ranged Magplar. I will try to narrate during the rotation and the parse. I will try to hit the important points when I see them, but I will be focusing on my parse, so I apologize in advance if I'm not as talkative as I used to be. So you open with your ultimate. So again, you want to try to get 3 force pulses every time you're on your front bar if you can. Now, obviously, when you start heavy attacking, that's going to be different because that's when your dots are kind of going to be kind of all over the place. So obviously you can see there I only had time to do 1 force pulse, but as long as you get at least 1 off whenever you're on your front bar, that's normally going to be enough to maintain the concentrated force count, because you need to have 10 seconds between each force pulse. So again, I'm heavy attacking whenever I lay down my channel focus. can see here, sustain actually isn't terrible as long as you are heavy attacking every other rotation or whenever you basically need to relay your channeled focus like I am here. So one thing I do want to point out is that you can actually recast Purifying Light early because it doesn't work like other dots. It basically takes a percentage of the damage you have dealt and basically deals that at the end of the thing or whenever you recast it, whichever one comes first. So now we are in execute phase now, so I am going to start doing my execute rotation here. Now we're at 10%, so instead of I drop my Purifying Light, we just go Blockade, Spear. There's just a bit of lag there. Shouldn't mess up with parse numbers too much. So there we go. That is a parse with the ranged Magicka Templar. So it's not a terrible parse. We did have a little bit of lag towards the end there, but I don't think that affects our numbers too badly. So we're sitting at about 33k, so it's pretty respectable all things considered, and our regen per drain per second actually isn't that bad with Witchmothers. With the channeled focus and adding in a heavy attack every time you lay down your channeled focus, you have enough sustain to keep on going. So if the trouble comes with execute because Radiant Destruction is a fairly expensive skill to cast, so you may have the heavy attack instead of using a Radiant Destruction in order to maintain your Magicka. If that's the case, then so be it. That's just kind of the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. So you can see here with all of our abilities here, Blockade of Storms is up top with the most DPS. If you take our light attacks separately, if you take them combined, our light attacks are going to make up the most DPS, of course. Radiant Destruction, despite being used only a handful of times, I think I only used 6 of it, 6 J-beams, as we like to call it, it still made up almost over 9% of our DPS. So Radiant Destruction is a very powerful, and it's not even scaling properly. So imagine what you'd be able to hit if it actually scaled appropriately. So Radiant Destruction is a very, very powerful execute. It should be the most powerful execute in the game, except for the fact that it's bugged and it's calculating damage incorrectly. And obviously, we're going to be ignoring our ultimate here, but Purifying Light and Blazing Spear, Burning Light, if we can combine these two together because they go pretty much hand in hand, are our next biggest DPS contributors. So that's kind of why you want to try to maintain Purifying Light when you do end up going into execute phase, because it does deal a significant amount of DPS, particularly because of your Radiant Destruction. So everything else kind of falls to the wayside. So if you do have to break your rotation to res somebody or to play a mechanic, the dots that you're going to want to maintain are going to be Blockade, Blazing Spear, and Purifying Light. If you need to drop a dot because you have to break your rotation, make sure it's Vampire's Bane and things like that. And again, for Crushing Shock or Force Pulse, you want to try to do at least one every time you swap over to your front bar, even if that means dropping your dots for a second or two, because you do want to maintain, especially on an imperfect stack, you want to maintain that concentrated force, that 10-second gap, so you don't want to lose that if you can help it. So that's pretty much it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.